Good evening. Thanks for coming. My name is Steve Ryfle, and I'm a visiting research fellow this week at the Black Film Center Archive here at IU. And first of all, I want to thank Dr. Francis and the staff of the Black Film Center Archive for inviting me. And I want to thank the IU Cinema for screening Personal Problems tonight and giving a platform to Bill Gunn and his work. And I want to thank all of you for having an interest in this film. First things first, house rules. No cell phones, no recording, no outside food except for bottled water. Is that correct? And this is a long film. It's almost 3 hours, and about an hour and 35 minutes into the film, there'll be a 5-minute intermission. I want to talk, or just say a few words about Personal Problems. It's a hard film to classify, hard film to really describe, but I think if you immerse yourself in it and allow the experience to captivate you, I think you'll be rewarded. I use the term experience because it's not. It's unlike watching a normal type of film. But before I get into that, I want to talk just a few minutes about Bill Gunn, the director of this film, because he too is rather difficult to classify. Bill Gunn's undergoing right now, almost 30 years after his death, a critical and somewhat, in the art house sense, a commercial reappraisal and resurgence. This is thanks to Kino and its theatrical distribution of this film and its restoration of this film, as well as previously of Ganja and Hess, Gunn's art horror film. He's now reaching a far greater audience and receiving more and better reviews than he ever did in his lifetime, and that's because he really had a problematic career. Bill Gunn was one of 4 directors. At the end of the 1960s, the Hollywood studios took an interest in the African American audience, really for the first time, producing a handful of films that were told from the African American perspective rather than having, an integrationist type story with a Sidney Poitier type of character. And there were 4 African American directors that were hired to direct feature films for Hollywood studios for the first time in 1969 and 1970. They were Gordon Parks, the writer and photographer who directed The Learning Tree, an adaptation of his memoir. Ossie Davis, the actor and activist, directed Cotton Comes to Harlem, which was based on a Chester Himes book. There was Melvin Van Peebles. He directed a great comedy called The Watermelon Man. And there was Bill Gunn. And Bill Gunn was kind of the outlier in that group. He had never directed a film before. He had written several unproduced, he had written a number of screenplays, 2 of which were produced at the end of the 60s. The Angel Levine, he wrote the adaptation of that for Harry Belafonte's company. And he wrote the script for The Landlord, which was Hal Ashby's first film. That is a wonderful film, and if you haven't seen it, I strongly encourage you to check it out. Very different from what you're going to see tonight, though. And Bill Gunn had been around. He'd been kicking around in New York for the better part of 20 years by that point. He came to New York in the late 40s to act. He discovered the love of acting, and he worked on the stage. He actually appeared on Broadway with James Dean in the early 50s. He got a lot of great notices for his performances on the stage. He began to write plays at the end of the 1950s. Became kind of a prolific playwright. He wrote a novel in 1964, All the Rest Have Died, and eventually began writing screenplays, and that led to his eventually becoming a film director. But Bill Gunn, though he's an African-American filmmaker, he didn't make what you would call black films, quote unquote, especially not by the standard of the time. Those films that were made in the late 60s, early 70s, by and large had an urban theme. They followed what we now would consider stereotypical patterns. And those films were largely, the content of those films, even if there were African-American directors at the helm, those films were produced by white-owned studios and white executive producers who were choosing, the stories that would be told and the people who would tell them. Bill Gunn didn't really play by those rules in every sense of the word. His characters, his stories were more influenced by his own middle-class background. He was raised in a family of performing artists in an upper middle-class section of West Philly. He was raised in an integrated community, an integrated education system. He had an integrated life. He socialized and worked with white and black alike. He was not, at a time when black machismo was a big factor in black film. Yeah, he was I wouldn't say the antithesis of that, but he was not, he didn't play your stereotypical kind of characters even before that. He didn't play your butlers and servants, and when the Shaft and Superfly phenomenon came along, he wasn't interested in that either. His characters, the characters he wrote and the characters that he played, were educated, sophisticated kind of people. Not to make a joke out of it, but they were the kind of people who know their way around a wine list. So his very first film, I mentioned that he had a problematic history with all of his films, and that's one of the reasons why he was never able to reach the audience that he wanted to reach during his lifetime. His first film was titled Stop, and the script that he wrote was a romantic drama, a story of a marriage on the verge of a breakdown, a white couple, and they go to Puerto Rico and live in a house that they've inherited, and there things go downhill, and they meet another couple, and they engage in sexual liaisons and all kinds of things that were really risque at the time, and the film actually is quite graphic, even for a film of the time that was being made after the Hays Code, when there was so much sex being introduced into the cinema. Bill Gunn was not interested in this typical stereotypes of the black film boom of that early 1970s time period. Stop, his first film, because of the way he pushed the envelope. In fact, the producer of that film, Paul Heller, who later went on to make films like Enter the Dragon, Paul Heller said that everybody was under Bill Gunn's spell down in San Juan. He basically wrote a script, went down there, and once he started filming, began improvising. He found that there were other things and other directions he wanted to go in, and he actually pushed the script into a far more explicit and more daring direction. And once he came back and the film was edited and completed, the studio would never release it. To this day, Warner Brothers has never released Stop in any format, either theatrically or on home video. So a couple of years after that, and by the way, during this time period, even though he's making these sort of auteuristic, idiosyncratic films, or at least heading down that path, he's also making a living writing scripts for the studios, adapting a lot of books and other properties into feature film scripts, most of which would never get made, which is really the story of most screenwriters. In 1973, he was hired by a company called Kelly Jordan, which was making boutique African-American themed films. They were working with writers like Maya Angelou and James Baldwin, and they hired Bill Gunn based on his record in the theater in writing plays to write and then eventually to direct a black vampire film project. This was right after Blackula was so popular. But Bill Gunn wasn't interested in making Blackula, and he wrote a script that Kelly Jordan liked very much, but then when he set about to actually make the film, the story is that he went in a much different direction. He wrote, if you've seen Ganja and Hess, I assume that many of you might be here tonight because you've seen Ganja and Hess. That's almost an indescribable film. Again, you have to experience it, but it's a horror film, but it's also an art film, and it's a film that challenges the viewer on many levels, and really it's in some ways a film about what it was like to be an African American in this country at that time, told in a very unique way. And again, that film has a somewhat tragic history in the way it was released. Kelly Jordan, once they received this film, Bill Gunn was able to kind of run wild with it because the heads of the company were actually in Beirut at the time. While Gunn was shooting his film, they were overseas trying to rescue another production that had gone haywire. So once they had the completed film, they really didn't know what to do with it, and they marketed it, or attempted to market it the way the film that they had wanted would have been marketed, as a black vampire film. But it just didn't work. The film actually closed after 3 days at one Manhattan cinema, and the production company shelved it, eventually sold it to another company that cut it up and released it as an exploitation film called Blood Couple, and it was released under some other titles as well. Bill Gunn had his name withdrawn off of it. He was a very controversial person, or a confrontational person who was not afraid to stand up for his work. He went into the offices of the production company, Kelly Jordan, and the story is that he wanted the film back. He wanted he wanted to maintain control over it, but of course he didn't actually own the film. And in a fit of rage, he picked up one of those. In those days, the Sparklets water bottle was made out of glass, and he picked it up and heaved it across the room in anger. And so that was, for a number of years, the last film that he would make. He would continue to work as a screenwriter, and in those experiences, he also had a lot of conflict and trouble. He would write several more plays and books. If you're interested in his work, I encourage you to seek out two books, a play, Black Picture Show, and a novel, Rhinestone Sharecropping. They're out of print, but you can find them at libraries or used book outlets. And those books are semi-autobiographical. They tell a fictionalized version of his experiences making Stop and Ganja and Hess. Personal Problems, the film we're going to see now, is nearly 3 hours long. It was actually originally conceived as a two-part soap opera that was to be shown on public television and in educational venues and other venues. It was conceived by the writer Ishmael Reed and the poet Steve Cannon. And in the late 1970s, it originally was a radio soap opera, a radio drama produced for radio in New York. And it was produced through a process of improvisation with the actors and the writers. And eventually, when they decided to make a film version of this, extremely low budget, they worked with Bill Gunn, who directed it. And Bill Gunn takes the premise of the soap opera and basically creates something that is sort of a deconstruction of the white network television soap opera genre, which was really cresting in popularity at that time. This is about, you folks are too young, but this is when General Hospital had the Luke and Laura, I'm revealing my age here, but the Luke and Laura plot, which just exploded the popularity of that show. And it took soap operas in this crazy direction. Soap operas that are really all about plot and who's sleeping with whom and all that sort of thing. You have those basic tropes in Personal Problems, but this is a much different type of film. I guess what we're going to watch tonight are the two parts in sequence and with an intermission in between. This is a film that challenges you to stay with it. There are long passages of silence. This is a film that's not about plot, but it's about moments, it's about characters, it's about lives and situations. It's the camera is it's really interesting the way he uses the camera, because it's parts of the film are told in a semi-documentary style. There are a couple of parts of the film where the camera is actually appearing to be interviewing one of the subjects. This is a film that doesn't follow a conventional structure in any way. Just when you think you've figured out what the film is all about, it'll take you in a slightly different direction. And it's very intimate, and yet at the same time, it has a very epic feel about it. It's shot on video, and that in 1979, 1980 does not mean what shot on video today means, where you can shoot a cinematic quality piece on your iPhone. This was shot on the video technology of the day, and it's crude, it's rough, but those limitations, both visually and sometimes with sound, actually contribute to the way the story is told. This is a story that takes place in New York that's visibly decaying. This is 10 years after the assassination of King. It's several years after Watergate and the resignation of Nixon. It's just a couple of years after the city of New York went nearly bankrupt. There was a city at that time with decaying infrastructure, high crime, and the city is visibly blighted. This takes place in Harlem, and it's about the everyday lives of people there. Gunn takes us into their lives, their jobs, their relationships, and their personal problems. So I hope you enjoy it.